finish perhaps a little bit earlier, because interpretation will stop at about 5:30. And everybody will stay just in English language. We can still have 2 minutes for that. So our first speaker today is Dr. Hans Rogers, who is a lead economist with the Education and Global Practice of the World Bank. He has recently been named co-director of the World Development Report 2018 on education. In recent years, he has served as the lead World Bank negotiator for education for SDGs, as well as coordinator of the bank's activities on system approach for better education results, SAVER, and World Bank Group Education Strategy 2020, Learning for All. From 2002 to 2010, he worked with the Human Development Team in the bank's Center Research Department. He has published research and provided policy advice in various areas, including teaching policy, service delivery in education, and aid effectiveness. Before joining the bank, Mr. Rogers served as a staff economist at the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors in Washington, D.C., and the Indonesian Ministry of Finance in Jakarta. And he's also had research positions at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Career Development Institute in Seoul. He holds PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Yes, please, Mr. Rogers.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Semenoff, and thank you again to the Teacher Task Force and the Government of Mexico for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Could I have my presentation? Great. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about financing for teaching and teacher development, considerations for achieving the SDGs. And I'll explain in a minute what I mean by the considerations for achieving them. Let me open by saying something about the World Development Report 2018. As Professor Semenoff mentioned, it's just been announced that the World Development Report, which is the major annual report that the World Bank puts out every year across all fields, will be on education next year. Actually, it will come out in 2018. It will be entitled Realizing the Promise of Education for Development. And I'm going to be one of the 2 co-directors along with Dion Filmer from our research department. This is very exciting for us because in the years that we've had the World Development Report at the World Bank, this is the first one devoted entirely to education. We have in the past had a number of WDRs that focused in on education as part of a broader topic, such as the World Development Report on Service Delivery in 2004 that covered education, health, social protection, and has done a lot to influence our approach to education in the World Bank, but it's really exciting for us that this one is devoted specifically to education. And we think this is really a strong statement by the President of the World Bank, by the institution, about the centrality of education for the SDGs, for meeting the SDGs, and particularly for the fact that we've had a great accumulation of evidence on what works over the past 15 years or so, and now looking ahead to the 2030 goals, it's understood, I think now widely, how central and how important education is to achieving not only the SDG 4 and SDG 16, as we've heard, but all the goals. The themes, we don't even have a team yet, we're just starting to put together a team, but we do know some of the key themes that we want to emphasize. The first one is on the promise of education, something I don't need to convince any of you of. You all know the returns to education, not just economically, but in terms of citizenship, in terms of gender equity, in terms of so many other areas, peace, etc. So but we will lay that out strongly for those who are not in the education field. We'll also talk about the progress and the pitfalls in education over the past 15 years or so, all the progress that we made under the MDGs, but also all the gaps, particularly in learning, but also in access that we need to move forward on. And again, this is very familiar to all of you. I'm going to focus a little more in this talk on the next 2 parts and linking those to financing, the issue of teacher financing. The next one is on evidence on how to improve our progress toward these goals, and these very ambitious goals that we've now agreed to with the SDGs. And here we want to show that there's really been a proliferation of good, rigorous evidence that's the type that we can make policy on much more soundly than some of the evidence we had in the past 15 years ago, and that also is much more convincing to ministries of finance, to donors, to others that are deciding how much money to put into education. And then the fourth main theme will be about, well, how do we scale up to systemic change? It's not enough to have evidence that this intervention here or this program here is effective, even if it's very good, rigorous evidence. We need to be able to move beyond that and make a convincing case and figure out how to scale these results up to the level of the education sector as a whole. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to talk about how, on the issue of financing teachers and teacher development, we should be thinking, in my view, about applying these themes of evidence and scaling up to systemic change when we consider issues of teaching, financing teaching, and teacher development. So what could this mean for financing teaching? Here are some examples that I think will be useful perhaps to keep in mind under both the evidence-based teacher policy and systemic improvement. So first, we need to have strong evidence on what the shortcomings and needs are. Often the needs can be overwhelming in some contexts, but it's important to have good evidence on what the greatest needs are. What are the real bottlenecks for the next stage of progress? Also to have clearly defined causal chains. There is a tendency, or there has been in the past, a tendency in education to think if we put money into education, we will get results. We all have good intentions, we all care deeply about these educational outcomes, but the causal chain from the spending to the outcomes we care about in terms of better teaching and learning is not always well specified or well documented. And I think it's important to make that case strongly. Rigorous evaluation of impacts. Here I would say the education sector has really been leading the way. It's been, at least from the perspective of the World Bank, we would say, looking out across all the fields of development that we're active in, education has been one of them, I think, the best at trying to get out in front and say, okay, we understand it's important to show rigorously using counterfactuals, meaning using the appropriate comparison groups, whether a given program or policy is making a difference. And I think it's important to continue that in the area of teacher financing. Triangulation of different information and data sources. We're going to hear from Albert about a lot of data sources. UIS is a great source. We've already heard about TALIS in the previous session. We now have a lot of terrific information sources in education. The key is really not to rely on any one, but to triangulate and see, to understand what's effective in teacher financing in terms of getting outcomes. And then I'd also like to stress the theme of constant learning and improvement. I think this is part of the virtuous cycle of professionalization that we heard about in the previous session from Juan Díaz de la Torre, which is really, we need to be learning constantly, we need to be feeding back into the policymaking process, into the program design, what is working effectively, what is raising the stature and status of teachers, and also improving their performance and their ability to deliver in the classroom. But we also need to think about systemic improvement. This has all been specific to particular teacher policies and programs, but we need to go beyond effective programs to change at scale. Very often we're able to point to an effective program, but then we don't really know how to scale it up to the teaching force as a whole or to all classrooms. And that may be because we put in more resources than normal into the... Hello? That may be because we put more resources than normal into the pilot, and so we've been able to make it effective, but we haven't always done it with attention to whether we're going to be able to scale it up to the system as a whole. We also heard in the previous session about this interconnection, I think from Dr. Syed, interconnection among the different factors. It's very important to be able to look beyond the teaching policy. We also heard from Juan Díaz de la Torre, the idea that it's not only effective teachers that make for great education and great learning, even though they're the central factor. We have to make sure they're being supported effectively by all the other factors, whether it's classroom infrastructure, whether it's textbooks, whether it's good management, etc. So that's what I mean by let's think about systemic improvement and not just effectiveness of particular teacher policies and programs. I think it's crucial to keep these ideas in mind, and I'm not going to talk in the remaining time about specific numbers or dollar amounts that you would want to put into teacher finance. And I know this will be a surprise to some people. I met our colleague from Saudi Arabia at breakfast this morning, and I introduced myself. I said I was from the World Bank, and he had a one-word response, which was money. We're not just about money, and there's a reason for that, because there's a lot of money going into education. We definitely need more in certain areas, but we also need to spend it as effectively as possible to get the results we need. And so we're going to have a lot of discussions about financing particular programs, particular policies in the coming years and months in these international fora, also domestically. There's, I think in many cases, there are going to be appropriate pressures to focus on financing teachers. Let's also think about how to make sure those resources are spent as effectively as possible. So we need this solid direction to the financing for it to be effective. I would say the key is really to orient these discussions, including maybe starting tomorrow, toward the long-term goals we're trying to meet in terms of effective teaching and learning in the classroom. The alternative, and my fear, is that 5, 10, 15 years from now, when we look back, we realize perhaps we have persuaded people to put more money into teaching, which they must do, but we don't get the results that we want to see. And so it's very important that we not be looking back 10 years from now and saying, why did we not design this as effectively as possible to make sure that that funding really made a difference? And I have some experience with this. I know we have some colleagues here from Indonesia. Over the past 10 years, we've been working with the Indonesian government, which has made a major push, admirably, to try to professionalize, improve the status of their teaching profession. They've spent billions of dollars in the process, in raising teacher salaries, in trying to strengthen teacher skills. The problem is, up to now, we are not really seeing results in terms of improved teaching in the classroom or improved learning. I believe that this can come, but it's been very important to evaluate, which we've helped them with, to be able to trace through what the problems are so that we can go back and in this cycle of learning and then adapting to make changes to make that as effective as possible. And I hope that in the coming years we can build that same cycle of learning with the help of the TEMR, for example, and the other, and our World Development Report and other resources to make sure we're learning and constantly adapting our teacher financing. So let me say a little bit, because we're collaborating, we're supporting the Teacher Task Force in applying the Saber Teachers Program to try to understand better how effective the policies in 27 countries are in trying to professionalize the teaching force and make it as effective as possible in the classroom. The Saber Teachers Framework, which is based on a couple of years of pretty in-depth research looking at all the global evidence, was done by my predecessor, Emiliana Vegas. Very good work that laid out 8 teacher policy goals, and it argues that all effective systems are really striving towards, and that together constitute this kind of virtuous cycle of professionalization that we heard about in the previous session. One is setting clear expectations for teachers, the first policy goal, so make sure teachers know what they're supposed to be doing and why. Second is attracting strong candidates into teaching, which we also heard about in the previous session. A third is preparing teachers with useful training and experience, which Dr. Syed talked about, that it's crucial, for example, to, and I guess we heard from Juan Diaz as well, it's important for teachers to get practical experience in the classroom, for example, as well as good training in the classroom, in their classrooms. Matching teachers' skills with student needs. This refers to the idea that often, in many countries in which we work, the best teachers go to the most advantaged schools rather than the least advantaged schools. And we need to make sure, in order to promote equity, we need to make sure that we are sending strong teachers into the most remote rural locations, for example. The fifth policy goal is leading teachers with strong principles, so making it clear that the principal can be a pedagogical leader and can support the teachers in effective teaching. Another goal is monitoring teaching and learning so that we know whether or not the teaching is happening the way the system would like it to, and the way that we know is effective, and whether students are learning or not. Learning here is defined broadly in ways that I'm sure Albert will probably talk about. Policy goal 7 is supporting teachers to improve instruction. This is really about professional development, which we've also just talked about. And then 8 is motivating teachers to perform, because there are quite a number of systems we work in where motivation is a big problem. It's not only a question of equipping teachers, it's also a question of making sure that they're going to use their skills to the best advantage for their students. So in the 5 minutes I have left, let me just go over how we would apply these WDR principles, or proto-principles, before we even write anything, to 3 of these policy goals. So 3 examples. Let me take attracting the best into teaching, which clearly involves financing, supporting teachers, so professional development, again, a major expenditure of this education system, and motivating teachers to perform, which also involves teacher pay as a major component. So the first one, attracting the best into teaching. So what would it mean to have an evidence-based strategy? So a first step is to really have evidence on intake and turnover and get a sense of what the margin is for improvement. Often we know teacher salaries are low in many countries, but they're lower in some in relative terms than in others. And it's important to be able to look at teachers' behavior and see, is your binding constraint right now, is the main problem the teacher's salaries, or is it some other aspect of their work? And you can get a sense of that by looking at who you're attracting into the profession, how many teachers are leaving the profession in the first few years, as we heard in the previous session. Evidence on competing careers. What other options are there for teachers, and how can we compete with those other options? Causal chain. So how long will the improvement take, and why? This came up in the Indonesia example, where one of the major mechanisms by which they were going to be strengthening teaching and learning was by attracting better people into the classroom, into the teaching profession. That is important, but we have to recognize that's a very long-term strategy. It takes perhaps 10 to 15 years before you have a really large share of the teaching force having turned over with stronger new candidates. So you have to work very hard with those who are currently teachers. Systemic, so we think about a systemic approach. What does that mean? So it means working at scale. Can we go beyond, for example, if you're trying to attract high-quality teachers into the profession, in some countries they experiment with things like Teach for All. That may have its place, but that clearly is not going to solve, the numbers aren't big enough to solve the problem of quality in the profession overall. Interplay, so the interaction between different factors and different goals. Are new teachers supported sufficiently? So maybe we're attracting good people into the profession, but it turns out they're not getting the support they need in the early years, they're not getting the mentoring we heard about in the previous session, the induction programs, and therefore they're dropping out. Not necessarily because of pay, it could be because of something else. Let me do a second example, supporting teachers to improve instruction. What does it mean to be evidence-based when we're dealing with professional development? One is evidence on teachers' weaknesses. Where do teachers need and where do they want help? Where do they think they need help? Because it's unlikely to be effective training unless it's directed toward areas where teachers believe they need help. They aren't likely to retain it. Causal chain, same point, is, from the other aspect, is professional development targeted at the known weaknesses? Is there a system for that? Triangulation, so these teacher surveys, like TELUS, are useful in telling us, do teachers find the PD useful? But then we also need to triangulate. It's not enough just to get the teacher's impressions. We also need mechanisms for seeing whether the professional development actually affects teaching and learning in the classroom. And this is one that I think we've really been weak on as a sector in the past, and it's really crucial to push forward with that. And that's something we're trying to help some governments do now. We can do that with direct teacher observation of a sample of teachers, for example. We can do that by looking at effects on learning. If you set up the experiment correctly, there are a lot of ways to do it. The key is to try. And then systemic at scale are successful programs replicable at scale affordably. We may have a very good PD program, but it may have been so expensive that we can't scale it up. And is it reaching, interplay, do teachers have incentives to apply what they learn? The point I made earlier, that it's not enough to have the skills, they also need the incentives to apply what they've learned. And then the final goal, let me just talk about motivating teachers. So motivating teachers to perform evidence-based, so performance, we need to know, is low motivation affecting the quality of teaching? In some systems that doesn't seem to be a problem. In other systems we have very strong evidence that it is. Impact, so do we have good evidence on whether incentives defined broadly, that doesn't mean test score-based bonuses, it means incentives like, for example, it could be professional recognition, it could be bonuses of certain types. There are many ways to provide incentives, but do they affect how teachers feel and how they act? Cost, what is the most cost-effective approach? We may have a variety of ways to improve motivation, but some will be much more cost-effective than others, and we now have some good research on that. And then systemic, at scale, can we motivate teachers everywhere, i.e. especially in the remote areas where often the problems are most serious? And do motivated teachers, once we get them motivated, do they have the skills and tools they need? So that takes us back to some of the other policy goals. So, in short, how do we ensure that this financing adds up to achieving the SDGs? I think one important step is to screen all policies, programs, systemic reform plans by asking the question of whether they're evidence-based and whether they can contribute to systemic improvements, not just narrow improvements. Essentially, this adds up to, as again we heard in the previous session, I think it's not just about effective teachers, it's about effective teaching and learning. And if we apply all this, we can have real promise in getting to effective teaching and learning. Thank you very much.